Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the pewter ball python. The pewter actually consists of two genes, the cinnamon and the pastel. And both the cinnamon and the pastel can really vary in appearance just as a standalone morph. You can have cinnamons that are almost like a coppery color, and some of them are pretty much dark, almost like a normal looking snake. And the pastels can really vary too. Sometimes they can be really super bright yellow, and sometimes they'll be a little bit browned out. And if you actually make a pewter, breeding those two together, with both genes in the same snake, sometimes it can have really big differences in just the visual effects of two different pewters. And it's pretty amazing how you can actually have a lot of pewter combos, and a lot of times you'll have the same exact genes in a lot of these combos, and it'll have really different visual effects. So today I want to jump over to the internet and I want to show you the potential of the pewter ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com, and I want to start with the cinnamon. This is what one version of the cinnamon looks like. The cinnamon is one component of the pewter. And when it comes to cinnamons, you can actually take a whole bunch of cinnamons, line them all up on the table, and you'll end up with a whole rainbow of different shades of cinnamon. Some of them look almost like a dark normal, and some of them look like a really coppery color like this. Some are really super dark, and some are a little bit lighter. And when it comes to dark morphs, cinnamon is pretty dark. As a matter of fact, if you take two cinnamons and breed them together, you end up with a super cinnamon, which is a completely patternless snake that is really like a dark chocolatey brown, almost jet black in some cases. And here is another component of the pewter, that is the pastel. This is one version of the pastel. Pastels can be really variable too. As a matter of fact, some of them are really super bright and some of them are pretty browned out. And as a matter of fact, if you actually took even the brightest pastel, and as you grew it up and as it aged, a lot of times the pastels will tend to fade out unless you mix it with the right genes like Desert Ghost or something like that. And if you actually take a pastel and you breed it to a cinnamon, this is what you get. You get the pewter, and this is one version of the pewter. It's pretty amazing. Some of these pewters almost look like it's an axanthic with, you know, no colors. It almost looks like a silver, black, and kind of a gray snake in some of the really interesting looking pewters. Here's another version. I actually pulled up 3 versions of the pewters, and this is kind of gonna blow you away, all the different versions of the pewter. This one has it almost looks has the axanthic color with a little bit of yellow coming in on the pattern. And here is another version of a pewter. It's pretty amazing. All these have all the same exact genes, and it's so variable from one another. As a matter of fact, I had like 8 different snakes up here. I was like, all right, I'm just gonna cut it off at 3 examples just to show you how really variable the pewters can be with the cinnamon and the pastel. As a matter of fact, you can actually, when it comes to the cinnamon's also allelic with black pastel, so they're kind of interchangeable. As a matter of fact, you can actually make a pewter using black pastel instead of cinnamon. And take a look at this. This is what we call the black pewter, which is using the black pastel instead of the cinnamon. So it's the black pastel and the pastel, and even these can be really variable too. So it's a little bit confusing. If you actually look at the black pewter, they actually don't contain cinnamon, they contain black pastel. As a matter of fact, if you actually took cinnamon, if you actually took the pewter and you bred it to a black pastel, one of the combinations that you'd actually end up with is this one right here. Take a look at this. This is called an 8 pastel, or in other words, it's actually called a pastel 8 ball. So the 8 ball essentially is the black pastel and the cinnamon. They act together as an allelic complex, kind of acting like a super. So if you actually took this snake, you bred it to something else, half the offspring would come out as black pastel, half would come out as cinnamon, and then of course 50% of everything would have the pastel in the mix. But it's kind of interesting. You mix it together, you know, some of these genes you actually mix it in with the pewter, and you end up with some crazy snakes like this. As a matter of fact, if you actually took 2 pewters and you bred them together, you get a whole bunch of different combos. I just wanted to show you a few of the combos that you'd actually pop out breeding 2 pewters together. And remember, the pewter is the pastel and the cinnamon. And here's one that you'd actually get. This is actually called the sterling. The sterling is actually the cinnamon and the super pastel. So you'd actually end up breeding two pewters together. You'd have some of the offspring containing 2 copies of the pastel gene. And essentially what that does is it brings out a lot of the pattern and really kind of changes the color of those. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of different versions of all these snakes. I just kind of picked out maybe the most common looking sterling among all of them. This is actually the super pastel and the cinnamon. And here is another one you'd actually make. This one's kind of cool. You'd actually make some silver bullets, which is a really cool combo. Makes you want to pick up a couple pewters just to breed them together to make some of these really incredible combos. This one's actually just the opposite. Instead of 2 copies of the pastel, we have 2 copies of the cinnamon. So this is the super cinnamon pastel, also known as the silver bullet. Pretty awesome. As a matter of fact, you can also produce this one too. This is the super pewter, and the super pewter is another version of the pewter that you can actually get. A really silvery snake. And what this is actually the super pastel and the super cinnamon, a double super, which is kind of really cool. As a matter of fact, if you took the super pewter and bred it to anything else, all the offspring would all come out as pewters. So you're looking kind of as, the edge as far as mixing pewters into other combinations. You could take this, breed it to like a pinstripe or something like that, and all the pinstripes would actually come out as pinstripe pewters. Pretty powerful breeder. As a matter of fact, if you look at the prices on these, not too bad for so many genes in the mix. This one's actually $650, and of course this is like it's a 4 gene combo, 50% chance it's actually het for pied as well. So speaking of pinstripe, I can actually show you what a pinstripe pewter looks like working pinstripe into the cinnamon and the pastel. The pinstripe is actually a dominant mutation. You breed it to something else and half the offspring come out as pinstripe. It's one of my favorite standalone morphs. It's a really super bright gold snake, and even as an adult it keeps a lot of the bright gold color in the pinstripes. Pretty awesome. And here's what happens if you mix pinstripe in with a pewter. Take a look at this. You get what is known as, this is actually a pinstripe pewter, otherwise known as a pewter blast, which is it's kind of an interesting name because the pastel pinstripe is a lemon blast, so they're kind of abbreviating it to pewter blast, and it looks almost exactly like a pinstripe, except the pattern is really exploded. Looks like a really incredible patterned pinstripe. Pretty amazing. So here is another gene we can actually work into the pewter. That is the Het Red Axanthic, and it's kind of a misnomer when we're talking about het red because it's actually a co-dominant mutation instead of a recessive. And they actually call this, it's kind of like a black back. It's kind of all the het reds usually have a really black back right along the back of the ball python. It's a really kind of a subtle morph. As a matter of fact, if you take 2 Het Red Axanthics, breed them together, you get a red axanthic that looks like an axanthic with all the color stripped out. It's kind of awesome. And here's what happens if you work Het Red Axanthic into the pewter. Take a look at this. This is pretty incredible looking snake. It's pretty much all completely patternless with just a little bit of freckling all through the snake. Pretty interesting. As a matter of fact, they actually call this the pastel gargoyle. So if you actually take a look at the genes in here, the cinnamon and the Het Red Axanthic are known as the gargoyle. The gargoyle makes some pretty amazing combos, and this actually has pastel in it. So you can actually call it the pastel gargoyle, or you could call it the Het Red Axanthic pewter. A couple different names you can actually name this snake. So here is the spider ball python. When it comes to one of the most visually stunning standalone morphs, I'd say spider is on top of the list. Makes for just a really impressive standalone. It almost looks like it has a spider web pattern right down the top, and the spider is like really variable too. You can have a little bit of white right on the bottom of the snake, and sometimes this white can come, halfway up or even more on some of the spiders. I kind of like about a halfway white coming up the sides of the snake. As a matter of fact, I actually produced some spiders one year, and I had a whole clutch of spiders. Some of them were almost no white on the sides, and some of them were high white, all in the same clutch of spiders. It was pretty amazing. And here's what happens if you work spider into the pewter. Take a look at this. This is crazy. This is actually what we call the pewter bee, which is, I'd say this is like the axanthic type version of the pewter. There's quite a few pewter bees over here. Some of them had quite a bit of color. You can kind of get an idea of what some of these variations of a theme look like. If you look kind of at the first three pewter variations I showed at the very beginning, some of them look really axanthic like this, which is, it's kind of deceiving, because you can actually see something like this like at a reptile show thinking you're buying into a recessive axanthic project when you're actually buying into a pewter project, which is the cinnamon and the pastel, instead of two copies of one of the lines of axanthic. It can get a little bit confusing. So here is the banana ball python. The banana is a codominant mutation. You breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as banana, and it looks almost like an albino if you're looking at the banana. A lot of times you can get tricked into just the visual appearance of some of these snakes, and you really need to know some of the genes and some of the genetics behind it, because if you're thinking albino, a lot of times you're thinking of a recessive mutation, which is a little bit harder to hit. And with the banana, you know, you breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as visual bananas right in the first breeding. You don't have to like wait for, you know, breed the hets and then breed the hets back together, and then, you know, it takes years and years usually working on an albino project unless you have a couple visuals to start with. So here's what happens if you work banana into the pewter. Take a look at this thing. This is probably one of my favorite pewter combos, working the banana into the mix. And you can definitely tell this is like the reddish version of the pewter, and of course the banana is really visually dominant when you mix it in with a lot of combos, so you can definitely see the influence of the banana and the pewter. All the genes make for a really impressive ball python. So here is the Anchi. The Anchi is actually, it really reduces the pattern in a lot of cases. And in a lot of cases it actually brings out a lot of the orange color when you work Anchi into some of these genes. As a matter of fact, Anchi is a codominant mutation. You can have a super Anchi, and the Anchi can be really variable as well. A lot of these ball python morphs can be super variable. Sometimes it'll really reduce the pattern, and sometimes it doesn't reduce it as much. And if you actually make a super Anchi, a lot of times the super Anchi has a super reduced pattern, sometimes just little bits of pattern right on the top of the snake, and a lot of super Anchi combos. And a lot of times the super Anchi will even bring out more orange in a lot of these combos. So here's what happens if you work Anchi into the pewter. Take a look at this. This is pretty cool because this is actually kind of unexpected how much contrast and brightness. It almost looks like a lesser or butter combo, you know, with all the brightness and the contrast in the mix. It's kind of an interesting combination with the pastel, the cinnamon, and the Anchi. Really amazing snake. So speaking of lesser, this is actually a lesser ball python. Usually when you mix lesser or butter in with something else, you get really bright, high contrast combinations. And a lot of people think the lesser and the butter are pretty much the same thing. Some people think they're two different lines of the same gene. Some people think the butter is a little bit brighter, but if you look at this one, this is a really super bright lesser. I've actually produced quite a bit of lessers here in my collection, and they can be really super bright. And here's what happens if you work lesser in with the pewter. Take a look at this beauty. That is really awesome. I really love the color coming through on this lesser pewter. You can definitely tell a lot of this color is coming from the lesser, and it even brings a little bit more of the high definition and the contrast from the lesser, working it into the darker pewter. So here's the last one I wanted to show you. This is the clown ball python. The clown is actually a recessive mutation, so it's a little bit harder to hit because you actually have to have two copies of the clown to actually make a visual. So a lot of times, so for example, if you actually bred a clown to a pewter, you could actually make pewter het clowns, and then you have to breed those back to either a het clown or a visual clown to actually make the visual clown pewter. But here's what happens if you make a clown pewter. This is what what a clown pewter looks like. Take a look at this. This almost looks like an axanthic clown. It's pretty amazing, the difference. And it's really amazing, the difference in the pattern really changes the clown pattern. Almost turns it into like a pewter. Almost looks like an axanthic, kind of a hybrid between the pewter and the clown, with a really crazy clown type head. A lot of times the heads on the clowns are, you know, kind of really interesting pattern on the heads. As a matter of fact, I bet this one's pretty expensive. Not too bad. This one's actually selling for $700. And the reason the price is pretty high in this one is because a lot of people kind of go crazy over the clown combo, so it's really in high demand. Plus, it's also a recessive mutation, a little bit harder to work with because you really can't see one copy of the clown gene, making it a little bit harder to actually hit the cinnamon pastel clown. So this is actually a 4-gene combination. Pretty impressive. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Money Pie asks, with ball pythons, do you have to change the water frequently like you do with dogs? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, that's the first time I've ever been asked that question. And with ball pythons, believe it or not, they hardly drink any water at all. You'll notice very little drinking with the ball python. They have a super slow metabolism. I say usually they drink the most water right after they eat, like a couple days after they eat. I say most people, usually they change the water maybe once a week with ball pythons. And a lot of times the water is perfectly fine even after a week. I say in most cases you probably have to worry about the water going stale versus the ball python actually drinking the water. And if you're actually using a coconut husk substrate, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll push the coconut husk or some of the substrate. If you're using aspen chip or other kind of a loose substrate, sometimes they'll push that in the water. And I actually go through every single tub every single day just to double check the water, because a lot of times they'll push a lot of that coconut husk in the water, and a lot of times, you know, they'll actually completely saturate it where they can't even drink out of the water. So I always go through, and even if it looks slightly discolored or maybe getting a little old, or sometimes I feel on the sides of the cup if it's even getting like maybe a little bit slimy or something in there, I just completely change out the water. And it's really easy in these rack systems because I have the disposable deli cups, and I can actually just keep washing and reusing my deli cups. It's super easy to actually go through and just change all the waters on a regular basis. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.